We have 40 million slaves in the world today, which is more than there were in the 19th century.
More slaves alive today
than there were in the 19th century during the slave trade.
40 million, you said, alive today?
Yeah. I've met slaves. I've met former slaves in Africa and elsewhere. People who are born as slaves. They managed to escape it. This is not an abstract point I'm making. I think that us beating ourselves up over a trade which our own country got rid of 2 centuries ago, and if anyone, we should be proud that we got rid of, and so on. There is a significant likelihood we are not dealing with, for instance, slavery today because we're so obsessed with going over again an issue that was closed 2 centuries ago. And, it brings to mind a phrase of Nietzsche's in the Genealogy of Morals. These are people there's a type of person who tears at wounds long closed and then shrieks about the pain they feel. We're dealing with a lot of those people at the moment. They do not themselves feel pain from the slave trade. They do not feel pain from colonialism. They have decided to rip at a long-closed wound and then cry in order to win something, whether it's pity or money or reparations or something. Everybody would have their own view on it. But I refuse to go along with this idea that, as I say, if everybody decided to take upon themselves exactly the amount of, as I say, it's a horrible idea, hereditary sin, but exactly the proportion of hereditary sin that their own society was accorded, then that would be one thing. It's quite another thing when only one group of people, and that white Westerners, are expected to be responsible for everything that anyone who looked even remotely like them in the past did. And everybody else is not. I mean, the obvious example to give is a point that Voltaire made in the 18th century. He said somewhere, the only thing, by the way, Voltaire now is one of the many figures who's been torn down literally in Paris. His statue has been now removed by the authorities in Paris. One of the great rationalist thinkers of French society. His statue was attacked so many times by people throwing red paint at it that it's now removed and you can't find it in Paris. Nobody knows quite where Voltaire is today. But now, part of the allegation is him that he profited through shares in some slave companies. They forget, by the way, that Voltaire also wrote in Candide one of the great attacks on slavery. But Voltaire says in his own day, he says, well, the only thing worse than what the Europeans have done to the Africans is what Africans have done to their fellow Africans, is what Africans have done to their brothers and sisters. And we know from the few memoirs we have of people who were slaves in this period, people like Equiano, Lauda Equiano, a most amazing man who was ended up British and was baptized in Westminster, became a free man, had a most extraordinary life. Memoirs well worth reading. We know from him, for instance, and many others, of course, that he was stolen by his neighbors in Africa in the 1700s. They a neighboring village. They came and they snatched them at night. That's what they were, people snatchers, they called them. And these Africans stole their neighbors and sold them. And now, what is the moral responsibility of the descendants of the people stealers? If white Westerners are to take some guilt, then I would like guilt from Africans as well. What do you do about African Americans who are descended both from slavers and slaves? What's their guilt hereditary wise?
They cash out at zero.
They would come out at, yes, exactly, the balance sheet. You end up there. If you when I was researching the slavery section of this book, I got into the very interesting story of the other major slave trade of the time, whilst the transatlantic slave trade was going on, which was the Arab slave trade. And the Arabs had a huge slave trade that went on for much longer than the Western one, the transatlantic one. It's thought that maybe 10 or 11 million people were transported across the Atlantic during the whole of the period of the slave trade. It's an appalling thing. It was an unbelievably horrible trade, which people at the time, most people at the time, didn't think was wrong because people in the past thought differently from us, and almost all civilizations, sadly, at that point, they'd all engaged in slavery. Everyone did slave labor. How were the pyramids built? The pharaohs didn't do it themselves. They didn't pay a fair day's labor wages to the people who hauled the stones for miles. The Acropolis in Athens was not built by stones dragged up there by Alcibiades.
Willing
It was
employees. I went to a church in Florence that was nearly 2,000 years old, and it overlooks downtown Florence. And the tour guide was explaining to us, I'm like thinking, this building's nearly 2,000 years, and it's been built up over time, but still the foundations are 2,000 years old, and a lot of the frontage of it is over 1,000 years old. And I said, well, how is it that people from so long ago were able to make a building which has stood the test of time? He said, well, you don't have the cost of labor.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Well, I'll come on to that in a second because that's a very important point. But just to finish that thought on the Arab slave trade, it was about 50% more people in total during the same period. So if 10 to 11 million or so were taken across the Atlantic in the transatlantic slave trade, it's thought that maybe as many as 18 million
from where to where
were taken from Africa to what we now call the Middle East, Arab countries.
By who?
Arabia. By the Arabs. The Arabs traded, as the Europeans did, in slaves from Africa. Now, you may wonder, why, therefore, are there not more black people in the Middle East? And there's an answer, which was that this was actually a genocide. The Arabs deliberately castrated every single male. So any African male they took to the Arab countries was castrated in order that there would be no more black people. Now, does that have a legacy today? Sure it does. If you go to Qatar, various of the Gulf states, you'll find that they basically have a slave labor class today. The Filipinos and others who are brought in and have effectively slave conditions. I've seen it myself.
Dubai's the same.
Dubai, nobody like FIFA cares about this, but this is the case today. In Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries, the word for a black person, abid, plural abid, is slave. They still call black people slaves. My friend Ayan, who was born in Somalia, spent a bit of time in Saudi Arabia as she was growing up, and they were black because they were from Somalia, and they were certainly blacker than the people in Saudi Arabia, and they were always called abid, slaves. So my point is not in any way to at all diminish what the European slave trade was or what the transatlantic slave trade was, but it is very, very strange to live in an era where it is presumed that only the West was engaged in such a thing, and only we, for the rest of time, must repay a debt which it appears can never be paid down. And that brings me to what you were just saying about what was going on in countries
Florence.
like Britain at the time.
Well, I mean, didn't you say that the life expectancy of a worker in Lancashire, England, was exactly half of that of a slave working at the time?
The average man in the north of England working in a mill, a mine, they died in their late 30s. So, I'm sorry, but yes, this is different from being a slave. But it's not so wildly different that we are able to talk about those people in the north of England as benefiting from privilege. These were not privileged people. These people did not have very many life choices of themselves. And here's one of the main points to make about all of this is the past was pretty much hell for pretty much everyone. I mean, even kings died and princes died of diseases which you'd now cure by a shot of penicillin. But the poor, who was almost everyone, they were not privileged people. And the idea that we have to recast all the ancestors of people who happen to be white as oppressors and the ancestors of everyone who happens to be black solely as oppressed is an incredibly simplistic game, and it's unfair. And that's one of the main problems about it, is it's just deeply unfair. And when you find an unfair game like that, you should ask yourself, why are we allowing this game to be played like this by people who literally declare themselves sheriff?
What's happening, people? If you enjoyed that, then press here for the full, unedited episode. And don't forget to subscribe. Peace.